The conversation surrounding racial equity continues. As public outcry grows about the lack of racial equity, quite honestly, so too do the questions. But before we unpack the lack of equity, let's go back to the beginning and define racial equity. According to the organization Race Forward, racial equity is the process of eliminating racial disparities and improving outcomes for everyone. It is the intentional and continual practice of changing policies, practices, systems, and structures by prioritizing measurable change in the lives of people of color. Dr. Kerry Mitchell Brown is a cultural architect and joins us to break down the subject. Dr. Brown, thank you so much for taking time with us, joining us here for the conversation. Racial equity, it's a word that so many of our advocates that we believe in have been using, but some of us may not be able to practice it quite as well as we think. Given the definition we heard from Race Forward, I'd start with you as a cultural architect. Is that a definition that you support and one that our viewers can move forward under, as an understanding of racial equity?
Oh, thank you so much for having me this evening. I absolutely support that definition that Race Forward lays out for us to, follow, begin to understand, and to put it into practice.
So when we try to put things into practice for racial equity, so often what we find in the United States is we will change individuals at the head of institutions, but we will not work to change the way those institutions function. If we're changing the individuals, but not the institutions, that does not feel like we're making any dents toward racial equity. Am I reading that correctly, or am I perhaps bringing some false information?
You are absolutely correct. And changing individuals is not enough. Changing the seats, it's really changing the systems, the practices, the culture within the organization. Organizations dealing with their own history in the way that they engage and treat Black people. What does racial inequity actually look like within their organization? Make it plain and take some action.
One of the things that we hear whenever we think about this, though, Dr. Brown, is so much pushback we get of, well, that's anti-American, or you're changing the fabric of America. But it seems in those instances, the people who would say something like that are putting justice on one hand and whatever the United States of America is on the other, and then asking justice in the United States to fight it out. Is there a way forward where those two things can work harmoniously?
There is a way forward where those things can work harmoniously, and we do have some history of it working. It's been a long time since it had worked, but we do have some history since it was working. If we think about it, the Reconstruction period, where Black people were at the height of our citizenship during that period, there was extreme active participation of Black people, including formerly enslaved persons in political and social life in the South. And they actually went to work within government and within organizations to work for the betterment of Black people in this country.
To be fair, Dr. Brown, we saw the violent pushback that we saw after Reconstruction. So at Reconstruction may have been the time where the United States may have been at its most inclusive. But the byproduct of that was amongst some of the greatest evidences of violence, citizen to citizen, that we've ever seen. Frankly, we feel like we might be on the doorstep of that now, even as we're only giving lip service to greater inclusion. Again, I don't want to be a pessimist, but is your studies telling you the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, all the markers and signs are there. There was extreme backlash from Reconstruction, and we did not see that through. So we have still been fighting since 1865 for the racial equity that we desire, that we deserve.
I want to bring in our panel here. We're joined again by Dr. Omekongo Dibanga, a professional lecturer at the School of International Service at American University, and by Reverend Jeff Carr, the founder of the Infinity Fellowship. Dr. Dibanga, I want to come to you. You work at American University, so you engage a number of different minds. And we saw our African-American word of wisdom was from Henry Louis Gates about this question of intellectual racism. Even before we get to the collegiate level of intellectual racism, Dr. Debanga, we see that at the K through 12 level, there is white backlash to resistance of teaching accurate retellings of history, let alone getting into any meaningful theory that asks us to wrestle with definitions and questions of equity and the systems in which we engage in. How do we begin that educational process if we're getting the backlash at the K through 12 level? And that must mean that we're going to get the resistance at the higher education level.
It's really a great question. And what I found at the higher education level is that I have students who are mad at what they didn't get at the K through 12 level. And that's why classes like mine and other teachers and professors who do what we do and what we talk about on this show are so popular, because they're getting real history. The way we challenge this on the K to 12 levels, because I work in a lot of these schools, public, private, and charter schools, on this very issue, is we have to focus on getting back to common definitions. I can't argue with somebody about critical race theory if they actually don't know what critical race theory is and all they got is their favorite talking point from Tucker Carlson. So what I'm doing when I'm going into these schools is I'm saying we have to have basically, as simple as this sounds, Ray, a glossary of terms that we can agree on. Because when we have common definitions, we can actually start to build common conversations. Now, it's not going to heal everything instantly, but if people can realize that, oh, when they mean critical race theory, they actually just mean not teaching Black history. When they mean that you can't talk about gender studies, it means that you can't talk about someone who might be gay, then we can start to build from there. But I will say this as well. We need to double our efforts to fight back this ignorance and this hate, because with many of the parents who are getting involved in these school systems now, all they're coming in with is talking points from their favorite talk show. But those of us who are educators and those of us who are parents who know better, we need to step up, because as Dr. King said, all it takes for evil and ignorance, I would add, to prevail is for good-natured people to do nothing. And that's why we're getting the book bans and the like that we're seeing today.
Reverend Carr, I'm coming to you because you work at the center of intersection of spirituality, where you don't put names on it in the ways that we otherwise assume. But if we listen to what Dr. Debanga said and we take that as our governing structure to move forward, we also found that there's opposition. Folks like Chris Rufo, who said himself, we can muddy up what this definition of critical race theory is. So if we need a uniform glossary of definitions to all work from, but everyone's ascribing their own meaning to this perhaps similar phrases, I'm coming to you because of spirituality, we might do the same thing, right? What does holy mean in one context? What is sacred in another context? How have you taken perhaps a lesson from spirituality that we can use here on consistency of definitions and understanding the same things when we use different or same terms?
Oh, surely. Excellent question. First off, thanks, Dr. Mitchell Brown, for the work that you're doing and that you're putting into the world as a cultural architect. I always love it when people say, I am going to practice Kujichagulia. I'm going to practice self-determination. I'm going to define something. If it's not out here, I'm going to make it up. I remind people that everything that we see and everything that we touch was made up. That's what creativity is. Even diversity, equity, and inclusion were made up terms. But what I've seen in spirituality is pretty clear. I try to give an example like this. Let's say you get three people together. You get a Christian, a Muslim, somebody maybe a Jewish person. Put them on the side of a mountain and you watch a sunrise. You start talking about the sun and you say, do you like the sun? And they said, yeah. What do you like about it? Oh, it's fructifying heat. Oh, it gives us, it gets our melanin going. Oh, it feeds the crops. It feels so wonderful. What does it look like? Oh, it's beautiful. I love the golden rays. All of these things are commonalities. Then you ask the question that's dangerous. Well, who made the sun? Somebody says, Jehovah. I said, no, man. No, man. Allah made the sun. Oh, no. Jesus made the sun. And all of a sudden, people who were in agreement are now fighting based on terminology and not on essence. If we can begin to create a common glossary, as we do in spirituality, and I say spirituality, not religion, I make that quick little designation there because it relates to something I'm going to say in a minute. Vine Deloria Jr., First Nations activist, he defined the difference as religion being for people who are afraid of going to hell, spirituality being for people who've already been there. So most of our people would fall into the space of spirituality, right? Because we've lived through some hell. So we have to find ways to make diversity, equity, and inclusion actually be that and focus on the middle part. When I've been asked to come in and have these diversity dialogues, and Dr. Brown, Dr. Omekongo, we've done all of this diversity talk, but what I found is people want to talk diversity. They want to talk inclusion. And the 4 to 6 friends that I had in the aftermath of the Breonna Taylor protests and the George Floyd protests, who ended up being tapped as the new chief diversity and equity and inclusion officer of the company, not because they had experience in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but because they happened to be one of the only few Black people there. So in a panic, they got tapped to lead these departments. But then when it came time to showcase diversity, they were put out front. When it came time to showcase inclusion, they were put out front. But then when it was time to bring in a speaker, and the speaker says, here's my honorarium, they say, whoa, I can't pay them. I got to pay somebody to come in and talk to us about this? Really? Oh, yeah, because the equity part is about economics. It's about equalizing the playing field economically, and it's about investment. So if we don't have the investment of the resources, and if we can't create a space, a common language, where we can talk about how are the resources equitably invested and distributed, then we're not talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It becomes, as Dr. Jerome Morris and I joke about, it becomes chief officer for diversion from equity and inclusion. So I would ask you, Dr. Brown, because you're an expert in this, we have this language. We know that, as Dr. Omekongo was saying, that people don't care what critical race theory is. They just find a way to use the term to advance their own prejudice agendas. How do we now begin to circle the wagons, Dr. Mitchell Brown, and create this terminology that's going to allow us to put pressure in these spaces to actually show us the money and the resources?
Dr. Brown, I have so much. I love this topic, and I only got 1 minute, and me talking right now is taking up some of that time. So let me come back to you, because something I wanted to ask that I'm curious how our audience might interpret this. When we understand what we're searching for, it is to improve the outcomes of people of color. But famously, our language in the United States is equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. So when I ask the question about U.S. norms and justice living in the same house, when we consider what Reverend Carr just told us about the honorarium looking for economic equity, when we think about the glossary of terms that Dr. Omekongo just told us about, making sure that we're all uniform, because that uniformity gets us to outcome equality. But outcome equality, or even outcome parity, it's a poisonous language in the United States. So those of us who care about equity, racial equity, gender equity, sexual orientation equity, ableism equity, those of us who care about this equity, how do we make the case to those who care so much about the rhetoric of the United States that even the mere idea of equality of outcome is a turnoff?
Yeah, I would say that making sure that we are clear on the terms is correct, and making sure that we don't get lost in a debate or a war on definitions, and really get at doing the work that is required. Seismic shifts are necessary, not just individuals, not just organizations, not just government. It all comes together, and it's not a zero-sum game, right? So people are holding that, in order for Black people to get something, then we have to give up everything else. How about just treat us like human?
Yeah, that is a lovely line to leave folks with. How about just treat us like humans, right? The belief in limited resource means that one has to take from another to get. When we don't have limited resources, we don't have to hoard from one another. Dr. Kerry Brown, how can folks find or follow you? How can they stay in touch with you for all the work that you're doing if they want to keep up?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on all social media, Dr. Kerry M. Brown, or you can go to my website, kerrymitchellbrown.com.
Back to that roll my unfiltered video in just one moment.
Time to be smart.
Roland Martin's doing this every day.
Oh, no punching!
Thank you, Roland Martin, for always giving voice to the issues.
Look for Roland Martin in the whirlwind, to quote Marcus Garvey again.
The video looks phenomenal, so I'm really excited to see it on my big screen.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
See, there's a difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
I got to defer to the brilliance of Dr. Carr and to the brilliance of the Black Star Network.
I am rolling with Roland all the way.
Honored to be on a show that you own. A black man owns the show.
Folks, Black Star Network is here.
I'm real revolutionary right now. Wow. Roland was amazing on there.
Stay black. I love y'all.
I can't commend you enough about this platform that you've created for us to be able to share who we are, what we're doing in the world, and the impact that we're having.
Let's be smart. Bring your eyeballs home.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared. You dig?